Hello and welcome to Lecture 7 of the Classical Era. And today we're going to be talking about Ludwig van Beethoven and listening to a little bit of his work. And then our next lecture is going to be dedicated completely to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and that'll be the final lecture of this unit. So Beethoven was born in 1770 in the German town of Bonn, which is famous for two things: for being the birthplace of Beethoven and also for being the capital of West Germany. Back when Germany was divided after World War II, the capital of West Germany was Bonn. Of course, since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, the two Germanys merged again, and of course the capital is back in Berlin, but for a while the capital of West Germany was Bonn. And of course, remember that until 1871, Germany was not a unified country. It was a region within Europe where people spoke German, but there were many different kingdoms, principalities, quasi-independent cities, and so Bonn was the seat, we might say the capital of one of these principalities, an electorate, I believe it was. And there, Beethoven's father was a court musician. So Beethoven did, in fact, come from a musical family. In fact, his grandfather, also named Ludwig van Beethoven, was a composer. Beethoven's father was, unfortunately, he was a singer at the court of the Elector Prince of Bonn, but he was not a very good father. He was an alcoholic, and he had three sons. Actually, they had a total of four sons. Ludwig was the oldest. There were actually two Ludwig van Beethovens. Beethoven's parents had a baby whom they named Ludwig van Beethoven. That baby died after about a year or so, sadly, and then they had another child whom they decided to name again Ludwig van Beethoven. And this is the Ludwig van Beethoven who grew up to become possibly the greatest composer of all time. Beethoven's father, when he noticed that his son, his oldest son, had musical talent, took the idea in his head to do what Mozart's father had done with Mozart. Remember, Mozart's world-famous child prodigy, and everybody knew that his father had taken him on tour and taken him to play before the royalty of Europe. And so Beethoven's father got the same idea in his head, and apparently he would make his son practice all day and all night, would sometimes come home from the bar drunk with his friends and wake up young Ludwig and make him practice. So Beethoven had a pretty rough childhood. And in fact, things got so bad with his father that Ludwig started sort of filling in at the court where his father worked to try and make extra money, because his father just was basically incapacitated by his alcoholism, just wasn't really doing his job anymore. And it's especially a bad thing to do if you're a singer, because it ruins your voice. So Ludwig became, over time, sort of like the head of the household. And in fact, when he was, I believe, 16 or 17 years old, when his mother died, he went to court to have himself officially made head of the household so that his father wouldn't take all of their income and just spend it on alcohol, and so that Ludwig could look after his two younger brothers. This was, by the way, right around the time when the book mentions that when he was about 16, 17 years old, Beethoven traveled from Bonn down to Vienna, hoping to take lessons from Mozart. And we don't have in Mozart's letters or his records, I believe, any record of their meeting. But according to Beethoven, or according to sources on the Beethoven side, Beethoven went and played for Mozart, did meet him, played for him on one occasion. And the story goes that Mozart gave him something to play, and or asked him, what would you like to play? And Beethoven sat down and played something. And apparently Mozart wasn't all that impressed. And Mozart said, well, why don't you improvise something? Just make something up. And so Beethoven did that, and that apparently impressed Mozart. And to the others in the room, he said, keep an eye on this young man. He will give the world something to talk about. Or another version of the story is, he will one day make a big noise in the world. And who knows whether this was really true or not, but this is the story that Beethoven later told. Unfortunately, it was around this time that Beethoven's mother got very ill. Beethoven had to go back up to Bonn, was not able to stay down in Vienna and continue study with Mozart. However, around a few years later, Beethoven did get sort of a grant, basically to go back to Vienna and study. Unfortunately, by this time, Mozart had just died. So Mozart died, remember, in 1791. But the idea was, well, why doesn't he go down and study with Haydn? Because this was right around the time when Haydn had essentially retired from his position at the Esterházy estate. And Haydn, remember, moves back to Vienna and begins a sort of a second career as more or less a freelance composer. And this is when Beethoven travels down to Vienna and begins taking some lessons from Haydn. And apparently this didn't really go all that well. Beethoven was, 20 years old and maybe 21, 22 years old, pretty headstrong. And this was a characteristic of Beethoven his whole life, did not take orders or instructions well. And he's in a position, he's studying with, the man who is now the greatest composer living in the world, Franz Joseph Haydn. Of course, Mozart had died, and but Haydn is seen now as sort of like the greatest living composer. And who is this upstart kid, and why does he have such an attitude? So apparently they didn't get along all that well. But in later years, as he matured, Beethoven did appreciate the contribution of Haydn and was more respectful towards him. In any case, Beethoven moves to Vienna in 1792 and basically spends the rest of his life there. Initially, he is more famous as a pianist, and he was a fantastic pianist, and everyone agreed sort of the most fiery and passionate performer of any of the many great pianists in Vienna at that time. But over time, he began to also gain fame as a composer. So this is what I would say is the beginning of the early period. This is one thing to know about Beethoven's career and his compositions. They are divided into an early, middle, and late period. And anyone who plays Beethoven, talks about Beethoven, musicians, they're always very conscious of whether a given work is early period, middle period, or late. And this is more true for Beethoven than with, I think, any other composer. I mean, we still talk about this sometimes with other composers, but it's something that's particularly important in Beethoven because we do have three distinct style periods. And I would say this early period is essentially the first 10 years or so of Beethoven's professional life. From, let's say, the time he arrives in Vienna, 1792, begins having his compositions published, begins making a name for himself in, again, what was the musical capital of Europe at the time, and is certainly a sensation with the public. And I would say that in this early period, he is essentially assimilating, taking in the style of Mozart and Haydn, and Beethoven was very much influenced by both of them. I mean, he knew very well the works of Mozart, performed them frequently, and of course he studied with Haydn, so he knew Haydn's style very well. So I would say that during this period, you might say that Beethoven is sort of like taking in this style, assimilating it, also making his own, but also kind of like amplifying it, intensifying it somewhat. So very often you find works that are larger, that have more extremes of, let's say, loud and soft, fast and slow. So it's sort of like an intensification of the essential style of Haydn and Mozart. But I think it's also fair to say that for someone who is not all that familiar with this music, you might hear an early period Beethoven work, and it's easy to mistake it and sometimes for a work of Mozart or a work of Haydn. So it's in this period that Beethoven's music sounds most similar to Haydn or Mozart. When we get to the middle period and certainly the late period, it is very distinguishable. You will not confuse it with Mozart or with Haydn. Right? It's quite different. It still uses many of these classical forms that we've talked about, and the techniques of the classical era. We could still consider it classical period music, but there are some important differences, which we will get to. So, of course, perhaps the best known thing, if you know one thing about Beethoven, it's that he lost his hearing. Now, this didn't happen all at once. It happened very gradually. But it's really the onset of his deafness that marks the transition, I would say, into his middle period. And it obviously represented a major crisis in his life. He started to go deaf, started to see the signs of losing his hearing when he was about 29 years old. And the way that his deafness progressed, which we believe was due to not any problem with his ear itself, but with his auditory nerve, the nerve leading from the ear up to the brain. And there's a lot of speculation on what caused this deafness. There is some idea that it might have been a result of syphilis, or maybe for the treatment of syphilis. Like many men in those days who never married, Beethoven never married, single men often went to houses of prostitution, and that's how they would often contract syphilis. In fact, our next composer, one of the greatest composers of all time, when we get into the Romantic era, the composer who is sort of like generally considered to be the first Romantic, Franz Schubert, died of syphilis. So this wasn't an issue back then. We don't know whether Beethoven's deafness was due to syphilis. There's some thought that it might be related to the levels of lead in the water or in the food that Beethoven was eating, because he liked fish, and the fish came from water. Apparently there are locks of Beethoven's hair still existing. In those days, you would maybe even give someone a lock of your hair as a memento. And these samples of Beethoven's hair have been tested and have been found to have something like 600 times the normal amount of lead that should be found in human hair. So there's something going on there, but in any case, we believe that his auditory nerve over time kind of started to die, started to atrophy. But it was a thing that happened over time, and it ended up being sort of like torture to Beethoven, because some days early on in this process, he'd like, I'm not hearing as well as and then maybe the next day is a little better, and then the next day it's worse again. And of course he would go to a doctor, and the doctors, again, had really no idea what they were doing back then, and they advised all kinds of quack cures, like, here's what you should do every morning: put your head in a bowl of freezing ice water to clear out your ears, or whatever it is. So none of these treatments worked. And it became clear after a few years of this that his hearing was really going away. And this is, about the worst thing that can happen to a musician, but maybe not in the way that you would think. And people wonder, well, how could he have composed all of his greatest works, the Fifth Symphony, the Ninth Symphony, when he was deaf? How did he know what he was composing? Well, if you can read music, and if you're trained to the extent that Beethoven was, then you can look at a score and know what it sounds like. You can write stuff down on staff paper and know what it's going to sound like. But still, you would like to be able to actually hear it. And Beethoven, as he was going deaf, went to all kinds of lengths to try and hear what he was doing. Even though he knew what it would sound like, he still wanted to actually hear himself play. So he had he had devices where he would have like a wooden stick or of some kind connecting from his chest or from his head even to the piano, so that the vibrations, or he would lie on the floor, take the legs off the piano, lie on the floor and play, so that he could kind of feel the vibrations that way. But the other thing that you might not think about is that for a musician, whether or not you can hear the music you are yourself composing, musicians just love the world of sound in the same way that visual artists love and are inspired by the world of sight around them. And in Beethoven's case particularly, the way that he got many of his compositional ideas was by just going out for long walks and hearing sounds in nature, birds chirping, for example, or shepherds playing on their pipes or whatever. And it was very disturbing to him to not be able to hear. And if all that weren't enough, people, of course, were going to gossip. I mean, here he is, the most, the greatest pianist, certainly, in Vienna, and maybe on track to be the greatest composer, because Haydn is now an old man. By the time we get to the early 1800s, 1803, 1804, Haydn is pretty old and is no longer able to compose. And Beethoven is the up-and-coming composer, so here he is on the cusp of maybe the greatest, being the greatest composer of his time, in addition to maybe the greatest pianist of his time, and he starts to lose the one thing that is, certainly for a performer, the one thing that you want to have, which is your hearing. And yet it's also interesting in that it's kind of unique that you could not be really a blind painter. I mean, there have been painters who started to go blind, and continue to paint for as long as they can. But at a certain point, you become completely blind. You can't see the colors on your palette. But you could be deaf and still compose, and Beethoven did. Now, they mention in 1802, Beethoven was in Heiligenstadt, a village outside Vienna, where he sought solitude during the summer. So he would go away to the summers to Heiligenstadt, out of the city. And while he was in Heiligenstadt, he wrote what is now known as the Heiligenstadt Testament. And it's basically just a letter to his brothers. This letter was never sent, but it was preserved. And it's basically Beethoven pouring out his soul on this predicament he finds himself in with his deafness. And he was, by his own confession, he was suicidal. He said, "I would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back. Ah, it seemed to me impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me." So, his response, initially he was very distraught, suicidal, but then he kind of said, no, I still have this all of this music inside me that I want to create, and that's what's going to keep me going. And so around this time, this is when we move into the middle period. And the work, more than any other, which kind of signifies the beginning of the middle period of Beethoven's career, is his Third Symphony, also known as the Eroica Symphony. This symphony is kind of interesting because it was originally composed to be dedicated to Napoleon. Right? This is when Napoleon was seen as this incredibly heroic figure, and also as the man who was going to bring the ideals of the French Revolution of liberty, equality, and fraternity, brotherhood, was going to spread those ideals across the rest of Europe. Unfortunately, of course, things didn't turn out that way. Napoleon, for one thing, crowned himself emperor. And when he did this, Beethoven and many others became kind of disgusted with Napoleon and said, well, look, he's no better than all the other, kings and queens and tyrants and emperors of Europe. And in fact, that was correct. Napoleon was more interested in military conquest and his own glory, really, than liberating the peoples of Europe. But what was originally supposed to be a grand symphony in honor of Napoleon, after Napoleon crowned himself emperor, and Beethoven heard about this, he violently scratched out the dedication to Napoleon and instead called it a heroic symphony. Eroica is simply the French word for heroic. Heroic symphony in memory of a great man, sort of as if Napoleon had died. And in a sense, I guess Beethoven felt that the great man that was Napoleon had died, and instead he'd been replaced by this emperor, this self-crowned emperor. And in fact, the slow movement of the Eroica Symphony is a funeral march. And this, again, sort of signifies the death of this heroic figure. It's not a literal death in the case of Napoleon, but a sort of a death of the man that Beethoven thought he was. Anyway, what it is about the Eroica Symphony, first of all, it was by far the largest, longest, grandest symphony that anyone had ever composed. I would say it's almost twice as long as a typical Mozart symphony. So it's just on a giant scale. And this begins the middle period, which includes works like the Fifth Symphony, which we'll look at in our next lecture, which includes, I would say, most of the familiar works of Beethoven are the middle period works. And this is a time when his deafness is, it's there. There's not much he can do about it. It affects his personality. The middle period works they have extremes of emotion. They're sometimes just extremely energetic, overwhelming, almost manic on the one hand, but on the other hand, it can be often sort of very catatonic. It's very bipolar music. And I would say that, remember what one of our classical characteristics I said was the idea that the emotions are to be controlled and kept in check, because to be over emotional, that's like kind of a Baroque thing, right? And it would go beyond the bounds of good taste. And I would say this is a principle that Mozart and Haydn sort of internalized, that you shouldn't be overly emotional. Well, Beethoven's middle period works are often extremely emotional and very personal. You can tell it's something that's coming right out of Beethoven's soul. But I think that is also universal. It's sort of like Beethoven, like what I am experiencing is, now I have my own struggle, my deafness and whatever else, but everybody has some kind of struggle. It's sort of like this struggle of existence as a human being. So it's very universal as well as being very personal, I think, when you listen to Beethoven's music. Anyway, so the middle period, I would say, goes from roughly 1803 with the Third Symphony until around the early 18 teens, like 1812, 13, 14. And when we get to the late period, I would say maybe like the last 10 or 12 years of Beethoven's life, roughly. Beethoven dies in 1827. This is the time when Beethoven is completely deaf by this time, right? And he can no longer perform on the piano. He actually did continue playing for a while, even with his hearing very degraded, until the results were just kind of too embarrassing. He couldn't do it anymore. But he could still conduct, even though he couldn't really hear what he was conducting. For example, the Ninth Symphony, which is the only one of the symphonies that is a late period work, he conducted the premiere of the Ninth Symphony, even though he couldn't hear a note of it. And there was apparently someone sort of standing next to him who was sort of like helping to do the real conducting, sort of like the training wheels for Beethoven. And when the piece was over, after the very end of the piece, and Beethoven put his arms down, he didn't realize that the audience was going crazy behind him. So the first violinist kind of stood up and like turned him around so that he could see the wild applause that he was getting from the audience. Anyway, the late period works are the most experimental. And they were not very well received, actually, in Beethoven's own lifetime. And he was conscious of this. He said to people, like, this is really music that is not for today, but for the future. It will be understood later on, but he was not surprised that it was not very well received. And a lot of people thought that, like, what's he doing? Has he gone crazy? Is it the deafness? And Beethoven was also a very eccentric person, even aside from the deafness, which caused him to become sort of to withdraw from society, become more isolated, become more kind of irascible and ill-tempered very often. But in the late period, you find much more experimentation with, for example, unusual numbers of movements, with connections between movements, which was not really a thing in the earlier classical period. The different movements of a multi-movement work were kind of like separate. They were their own little spheres. Well, Beethoven, actually beginning in the middle period, beginning with the Fifth Symphony, we might say, is finding ways to connect the movements to each other so that they're sort of a more unified whole. We also see in the late period Beethoven is sort of looking both forward and back. So he's composing music that sounded kind of strange in his own time, and he's conscious of this and said, well, this is really music for future generations. But the inspiration for a lot of this music is from the past, from the Baroque era, from Beethoven's very deep study of the music of J.S. Bach. So we find in late Beethoven a lot of the use of fugues. Remember, the fugue is like the most challenging type of composition, of which the greatest composer is J.S. Bach, which involves polyphonic texture and subject, and maybe a counter subject, and all these different techniques that can be done to the subject, inverting it, augmenting it. So Beethoven is sort of setting challenges, compositional challenges for himself. Also the use of theme and variation form. So theme and variation was a very popular form in the Baroque, also somewhat popular in the classical era. But as we move into the later classical era, and really technically, since Beethoven lived all the way till 1827, and the Romantic era starts in 1820, at least according to our textbook. Now, most people would still say Beethoven is a classical composer. We put him in the classical era. But I think it's sort of like Beethoven has one foot in each era. He is, more than any other figure, sort of the transitional figure from the classical era to the Romantic era. And he was such an inspiration on the composers of the Romantic era. I mean, he sort of stood like a colossus over, he cast his shadow all the way into the Romantic era. Not just for his music, but because of his personality. I mean, as we will learn when we get to the Romantic era, the Romantic era is an era that, among other things, is kind of obsessed with the notion of heroic figures, like loners or misunderstood, tragic figures. People who overcome great odds. Well, here's Beethoven overcoming the greatest odds for a composer, losing his hearing, being maybe the greatest composer of all time. Now, I would argue maybe that's J.S. Bach, but you could make an argument for Beethoven being the greatest composer of all time. Despite this loss of his hearing, and just the idea of persevering and going on and composing for almost 30 years after losing your hearing, well, after beginning to lose your hearing and going completely deaf, and still continuing for the sake of art. I mean, this dedication to art, this sacrifice for art, and overcoming tremendous odds, struggle against fate. That's the Romantics were all into that kind of thing, and Beethoven was just the living embodiment of that. Okay, what else do they say? And by the way, I'm here on page 201. As a man, what about as a human being? He was, the book says, something of a mystery. He was self-educated and had read widely, but he was weak in elementary arithmetic. Now, and then they say he claimed the highest moral principles, but was often unscrupulous in dealing with publishers. So he would, they say, not good at elementary arithmetic and unscrupulous in dealing with publishers. Actually, it may be the case that he pretended to be not good at elementary arithmetic so that he could attempt to kind of screw over his publishers, or get more money out of his publishers. He'd write letters to his publishers saying, I sent you those sonatas last week, and we had agreed that you're going to pay me, X amount of money for each one of them, and here I'm only getting X amount of money. And then if he was caught, he said, well, no, actually, Herr Beethoven, if you check your math, you'll see that, and well, I'm not so good at arithmetic, Beethoven was, again, he was, as the book says, he claimed the highest moral principles. He thought himself very high-minded, but he could be an awfully nasty person sometimes. So here's an example. Beethoven had two younger brothers. One of his younger brothers married a woman whom Beethoven just couldn't stand, never got along with. Beethoven's brother and his wife had a child, a son named Karl. And then Beethoven's brother died. So Karl now has lost his father. And since Beethoven just loathed Karl's mother, he actually went to court and underwent this court battle against his own sister-in-law to gain custody of his nephew, to take his nephew away from the boy's mother when he was only something like 12 years old. And he actually won, because Beethoven was, a great composer. I mean, I'm not sure exactly if that's why it was, but I'm sure that had something to do with it. Beethoven was the greatest musician in Vienna, and his sister-in-law was a nobody, so yeah, why not? Beethoven tried to do then, he got his nephew Karl, poor kid, taken away from his mother, and proceeded to attempt to do to this boy what his own father had done to him, to try and make him into a great musician, forced the boy to practice, and just drove the poor kid crazy until when he was, I believe, 16 years old, his nephew attempted suicide, tried to shoot himself in the head. The gun apparently slipped and he just kind of grazed his skull. But, there are many accounts of Beethoven being just very difficult to deal with. In particular, in his dealings with the nobility. On the one hand, Beethoven knew how to kind of appeal to, ingratiate himself with the nobility, because they were going to be the ones who were going to be like commissioning pieces from him. Although, as the book says, Beethoven never in his adult life had a court composer type job. All right? He never worked as anyone's musical servant. However, his greatness was recognized to the point that in 1809, 3 noblemen committed themselves to give him an annual income. So that just basically pooling their money and giving Beethoven an income every month, a regular income, in addition to whatever he was making from concerts or giving music lessons. so that he would not leave Vienna and go someplace else, because they wanted to keep him in Vienna. That's how he was like a cultural treasure of the city. These noblemen committed themselves to giving him an annual income, their only condition being that he remain in Vienna, an arrangement unprecedented in music history. Right? So Beethoven did quite well, unlike, remember, Mozart, who attempted a freelance career but ultimately failed, at least in terms of being able to support himself. Beethoven succeeded where Mozart had failed in this area. I should also mention, I think I mentioned last time in comparing and contrasting with Mozart, Beethoven did not compose with great fluency and rapidity the way Mozart did. He didn't have fully formed compositions just kind of appearing in his mind. Beethoven worked things out over a long period. Things would be sketched out, and then he would turn over ideas, turn over those sketches, and you can even find, basically every scrap of paper Beethoven hung on to. And so you can look and you can see these sketchbooks. Now, when you look at them, they look like scribblings of a 2-year-old. I mean, people who are trained to read Beethoven's handwriting can, I guess, make sense of them and say, oh yeah, here's the theme from such and such piano sonata, and here you can see that Beethoven is I've looked at them and they just look like mad scribbling to me. But be that as it may, you can trace the development of Beethoven's works in these sketchbooks, and they had very often sort of a long gestation period. And for that reason, Beethoven composed, even though he lived more than 20 years longer than Mozart, probably composed only about a quarter, if that, the amount of music that Mozart did. Composed in all different genres, although there's only one opera by Beethoven. He had a kind of a hard time getting this opera composed and produced and performed, and so I think that put him off from trying it again. But everything else, especially his 9 symphonies, of course, lots and lots of chamber music, lots and lots of piano music. Beethoven was himself primarily a pianist. He composed 32 sonatas for piano. Many of them very large works at a technical level that is just a level above anything by Haydn or Mozart. There are 5 piano concertos and 1 violin concerto. There are oratorios. There's a great mass, the Missa Solemnis by Beethoven. So there are songs for voice and piano. That's a genre that's going to become very popular in the next era, by the way, what we call Lieder, German art song. So all different genres of music from Beethoven. Okay, let's listen to an example. This is an example that's in your book. This is an early period work. It is the Piano Sonata in C minor, Opus 13. So this is Beethoven's 13th published work. It's composed in 1798, so Beethoven would have been about 28 years old. And it has the nickname Pathétique. Now, many of Beethoven's sonatas have these sort of nicknames. For example, you've probably heard of the Moonlight Sonata, which is very unusual. Starts with a slow movement. This thing. Right, you've all heard this before. This is, again, sort of an example of Beethoven's experimenting and kind of taking the expectations of the classical audience. We've been talking quite a bit of what to expect in a first movement, a second movement, etc. Beethoven loved to kind of turn these expectations on their head. So starting out a sonata with a very slow movement like that, it's unexpected, it's different, This is the kind of thing Beethoven excelled at. This work, one of Beethoven's better-known piano sonatas, it begins with a fast movement very fast actually, but that fast movement has a slow introduction marked grave, serious, right? Now this itself was not all that unexpected, right? To begin a fast movement with a slow introduction was something that was sometimes done in the classical era. But what is unexpected here is that, when we hear that slow introduction and then we get into the fast movement, we expect it to be, okay, that fast first movement all the way through. Beethoven brings back the slow introduction material at the beginning of the development section. So that is something that an audience would not have expected at that time. In many other ways, this conforms to the form, the sonata form that we've talked about before. Has a first theme, bridge, second theme, etc. It also has an extended, energetic coda. This is one of these characteristics of Beethoven, especially as we go into the middle period. Very often the coda is greatly extended. Remember, the coda is supposed to be the concluding section. It's just sort of like the little conclusion. But Beethoven turns that expectation on its head. Instead, it becomes greatly extended. It becomes sort of developmental instead of a sort of a summation. And instead of like bringing things to a conclusion and tying up loose ends, it kind of unpacks and develops again and raises the tension. Sometimes in these codas are, like in the Fifth Symphony, the coda of the first movement is maybe the most intense part of the piece, as you will hear if you listen to it, because it's another one of our listening examples and going to be the subject of our next lecture. Anyway, let's listen to the Sonata Opus 13, composed 1798, just the first movement. This is a 3-movement sonata, but we're just going to listen to the first movement. And again, it begins with this very serious, solemn introduction. And the tempo is very slow. And notice this mood is it's sort of like almost sort of depressed, like someone who is rousing themselves into motion. And we hear this back and forth between ya-dum, da-da-dum, bum, bum, bum. There's sort of a dialogue going on. One voice is sort of pleading, and then the other one is sort of like refusing. This bipolar aspect that I'm talking about. And there's definitely sort of a tragic air about this. It suddenly becomes sort of very delicate. Notice the dramatic pauses, the silences. And then this scale and allegro. Notice how fast it is. It's allegro di molto e con brio, so like extremely fast. Here's the bridge. And here comes the second theme. And this is quite difficult. You have to cross your hand because the one hand is playing the chords and the other hand has to jump over and get extremely difficult. And the closing theme here. So we're coming to the end of the exposition, getting to the development section. And we have that slow introductory material coming back. And again, this would not be expected in the classical era. And he uses this material to begin modulating to a different key. And again, we have this sort of catatonic lulling, this ebbing of energy. And then the energy is back. It's sort of manic energy. Go from catatonic to manic. Now we're getting to the end of the development and recapitulation. This is our first theme. Bridge. Second theme. Again, we have this driving energy, very characteristic of Beethoven. Closing section of the recapitulation. Now, this is about where we'd expect it to end. Like right here. But he brings back the slow introductory material again. Actually, only half of it. Half of each measure, basically. This would have been very, very curious and puzzling to the audience of 1798. And it almost sounds like the piece is going to start all over again. But this is just the coda. And there you go. Okay. Actually, I wish we had time to listen to the other two movements of that sonata. The older editions of the book used to have them in there, but they're no longer included. Instead, I'm going to talk very briefly about the Fifth Symphony, which we are going to devote the entire next lecture to. So this is obviously the most famous work of classical music of all time. Now, maybe most people only recognize the first four notes or the first movement, but it is a four-movement symphony, and that motive that you hear, specifically the rhythm, the short, 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 long rhythm, is sort of like the basic building block that the entire symphony is made of. You find that rhythm reappearing in all sorts of ways in all four movements, and it's an element that kind of, again, ties the different movements together and makes it sort of more of a cohesive whole. The Fifth Symphony is a middle period work, was first performed 10 years after the one we just listened to, 1808. And the first movement, well, I'll just talk a little bit about each of the movements, but before we listen to it in our next lecture. You've got a listening guide for all four movements. The entire symphony really has to be experienced as a whole, because again, it's integrated in a way that no symphony before had ever been, and that's why they have all four movements here. The first movement is in sonata form. But what's interesting is that it doesn't really have much in the way of themes. Instead, we just have that motive. And that we have sort of short melodic snippets constructed out of that motive. And we have the usual opening theme, bridge, second theme, where the mood is a little bit the intensity subsides somewhat, but comes roaring back. We have a development section, recapitulation, and then we have this coda, which sounds like a second development section. You kind of have to listen to it, understand what the coda, again, where we expect things to be sort of coming to a conclusion. Instead, the whole can of worms is opened back up again. And then what do we do after that? If the coda is like a second development section, what Beethoven actually does is there's sort of like another little coda on the end of that sounds like another recapitulation. It sounds almost like we're sort of like trapped in this Groundhog Day, this sort of endless cycle of time being a flat circle and things coming back around, the eternal return, as Nietzsche might say. But this extra little coda does bring the movement to a close. Then we get to the second movement, completely different in mood from the first movement. It's very serene, very calm, very dignified, and it is in theme and variation form. Actually, it's sort of double theme and variation. There are two distinct themes, what that book calls Theme A and Theme B. Sort of like, if you recall, in the Haydn Surprise Symphony, the second movement of that we listened to was also in theme and variation form, and it also had a sort of a binary theme. So similar construction, but a very, very different piece. Then we have the third movement. The third movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is not a minuet. It is a scherzo. And it is very, this third movement is sort of haunted. It's very dark and sort of grim, at least in the outer sections. The middle section is kind of like a jolly and rollicking or whatever, but the outer sections, especially when remember, third movements are generally in A, B, A form, right? And the scherzo or minuet that you hear as the opening A section is followed by a B section, called the trio, and then that opening A material comes back. When it comes back in Beethoven's Fifth, it's sort of like a ghost of itself. It's played with like pizzicato strings, and it's sort of very spectral sounding. It's a chilling kind of effect. Then what we have, instead of the usual break, like a little bit of silence between the third and fourth movement, which is again what the audience would expect, there's this transition that actually connects the two movements together. And at first, it's really just a single note that is held, or a pair of notes that are held. And we hear this kind of like dum bum 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 in the timpani in the background, and the feeling that you get is like you're going through some kind of dark, mysterious tunnel, and you don't know where you're going. You're sort of in between movements. You're in no man's land. You're in this passage leading from the third movement to the fourth movement, and you can imagine going through a tunnel, and it's starting to get brighter and brighter, and then suddenly this sort of you're out in the bright sunlight, in the overwhelming brightness of the fourth movement. The fourth movement is an allegro. It's in sonata form. but it is in C major instead of C minor. And this, the opening movement is very tragic, right? The one that we're all familiar with, right? The last movement is exuberant and sort of like the overcoming of whatever the crisis was that we experienced in the first movement, and also in the third movement. We emerge from that through this dark tunnel, and this last movement is the most triumphant, some of the most triumphant music you will ever hear. And it's in C major. So Beethoven begins the symphony in C minor, ends it in C major, sort of like the triumph over adversity kind of thing. This movement, again, has a very long coda at the end of it. And in fact, Beethoven, it's almost like he's playing a joke on you. Over and over again, he gives the impression that the piece is going to end. There are all kinds of like false endings, and then sort of like, but wait, that's not all. There's more, and it keeps going on. And then you get to another, what seems like it must be an ending, but it's not the real ending, and it goes on and on and on, and Beethoven is kind of like, again, playing with your expectations. What I would recommend you do is, before the next lecture comes out, before I post the next thing on the Brightspace, go ahead and listen to the entire symphony. It's only 40 minutes long, and I would recommend actually that you listen to it in a dark room, with no other stimulus. Just sit in a chair or lie down with nothing else to do, and maybe with the lights out, and just listen to it from beginning to end and see what impression it makes on you. Then maybe listen to it again with the listening guide, following along as best you can. And I understand that maybe many of you don't read music, but you can use the track numbers, where it gives you, like how many seconds in this happens, that happens, and you can use the listening guides to help make sense of it. So we'll see you next time for our final lecture of the classical era, which is going to be all about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. See ya.